Okay, so we're taking this lovely opportunity here to talk about two of the papers that I've written that actually, when I reread them, I think they're quite nice. So I'm pleased that you've chosen these for us to talk about, and the purpose of talking about them now on this video is to give students a way into them, a way into the kind of conceptualising that's being done in order to come up with the new ideas that are in the papers. So now what we're going to do is you're going to ask me questions, and to the best of my ability I'm going to reflect on what sense I make of those questions.
Yeah, that's right. What we've noticed is that when you have talked to students, postgrad students, that's really brought the material alive, and what we'd like to do today is to see if we can record something of that so that we can offer that to students who are taking up your papers, who are thinking there's something in there, but I want to understand it at a deeper level. So it's wonderful to have you.
So, I'd like to start with your chapter, Rethinking Behaviour in Terms of Positioning and the Ethics of Responsibility. And in that paper, you talk about positioning theory as a theory that helps us examine our complicity in the maintenance of social injustice. And you also argue with Judith Butler the necessity of disrupting the ongoing repetitive citations of the known order. So could you talk about what it means to engage in repetitive citations of the unreflected order? And my next question after that will be, and what would you call disrupting that order or rebellious speech?
So if we look at the repetitive citations or recitations or citational chains, as Butler calls them, it's part of the way we become human, that we have shared ways of speaking the world into existence and speaking ourselves into existence. And we're not necessarily conscious of those ways of speaking ourselves. We learn them, we learn to do them, we learn to become recognisable subjects in the world through those repeated citations. They are habituated, they're embodied, they establish what it is to be normal, what it is to be a woman, what it is to be a certain kind of subject, what it is to be somebody who can be respected. All of these things we have to learn in order to proceed successfully through the world. And so what Butler points out is it's really hard to turn your reflexive gaze on those repeated citations. Because we don't like to think that we're dependent on them. We have an idea of ourselves as liberal humanist subjects that we're independent of discourse, that we simply are as some essential being in the world, and that we don't depend on people's recognition of us through those discourses, and we don't depend on those citational chains to be recognisable subjects, where our normality, our femininity, whatever it is that we want to say we've achieved, should just be natural. And so they're naturalised, and so we can't recognise them. So a lot of Judith Butler's work in talking about citational chains, and then there are other philosophers like Deleuze who talk about territorialisation, and Bergson who talks about lines of descent, the habituated patterns that are instantaneous. You don't need to reflect on them, they just are. You can produce these without reflection. What we need to do as social scientists is turn our reflexive gaze on those habitual ways of being in the world so that we can examine them and question them. And Butler in particular is very good at talking about the ways in which our lives can become non-viable because we can't be recognised as valid subjects or legitimate subjects within those habitual repetitions, that there isn't actually a position for us there that can give us a viable life. So she says we have an obligation to challenge those citational patterns, and you can't challenge them unless you can see them. So there's a lot of work to be done to see how they get put in place and how they work. So the early work with positioning as a concept took an incident between a man and a woman where they got into an endless argument, and that particular argument was used to develop the concept of positioning and to show how it works, that people are positioning each other and positioning each other through discourse, through various discursive strategies. But what was missing in that earlier work, and that's probably the most cited paper that I've been involved in writing with Rom Harre, and that came about because I could see that he wasn't able to develop the theory that he wanted to develop because he was using the concept of role, and that kept taking him back to the very conceptual field that he was trying to work his way out of philosophically. So I offered positioning as an alternative that would enable him to think differently. But there was always a point of dissatisfaction with that concept and with that paper, that there was something I'd been trying to get in that paper, which he resisted very strongly, was to talk about power. And so in this paper, I go back to that particular argument and say there's something really missing here, and that's power, and how it is that the one whose identity is embedded in a dominant discourse, in the citational patterns of dominant discourses, and who takes that up, as we do, as a morally correct position, as a ubiquitous position, as an unchallengeable position, that person has a lot more power than the person who's trying to break those citational chains, who's seeing the fault and not knowing what a challenge might look like, knowing that there's something terribly wrong about the position they're being offered, but doesn't know how to make their way through to somebody in this morally ubiquitous order who is absolutely certain of their own rightness within the dominant discourse, with their positioning within the dominant discourse.
That happens with Bob, doesn't it, in this example here, with Shane, and he's up on the stage, and it's a wonderful image of him, bearing down on Shane, as it were, going, get that hat off. So
in the third example, so I take the original interaction between Sano and Enfamada, and that's interesting in itself. They're taken from the Spanish. They were Rom's choice, Sano meaning healthy and Enfamada meaning infirm.
Okay.
So the positioning is actually built into the names, which I didn't realise at the time. So the language actually infiltrates the names in that original example. And then I take an example of a gang rape and analyse that and show the continuities between the Sano and Enfamada conversation and the gang rape conversation, and the difference being with the gang rape that the dominant discourse of young men's entitlement to have to sexually exploit a young woman's body has been questioned, that the feminist discourse has now got itself embedded in law so that rape is no longer legal. And so whereas in the Sano and Enfamada position, there's nothing that Enfamada can say to get Sano to question the rightness of his position in the gang rape, there is now something called the law and being thrown in jail that will cause the young men in their dominant position as rapists to question their position. So everything's changed in that example. In the third example, Bob, the principal, is angry with Shane, and Shane has come into the school assembly with his baseball cap on, and Bob tells him to remove the baseball cap, and he doesn't. And Bob keeps telling him to remove his baseball cap, and he doesn't, and then Shane starts to walk out, and Bob yells after him to come back, and he doesn't. And so the absolute certainty of Bob in his position of authority and the absolute rightness, the morally ubiquitous order that he's operating out of, is that he has a legal right and obligation to be in control of the students, and that can't be questioned. And Shane, there's no chance that Bob can ask himself the question, if I were to regard Shane as a legitimate human subject and accord him a position of respect, I would wonder why he's got a baseball cap on, but I wouldn't see it as necessary to actually challenge him over that. I would ask him later why he had the baseball cap on and what was happening. So Shane then went to the school that Kath Laws was the principal of, where children who were being expelled, as Shane was, are sent. And Kath asked him in a very straightforward way, just said, you were doing so well, what went wrong? And why did you make the baseball cap your hill to die on? And he takes it off and shows her this appalling haircut, which is all patchy and half bald, and says, well, I couldn't let anybody see this. And of course he couldn't. No, his life would have been hell in school if anybody had seen that haircut. So that, you know, he could have wagged school, or he could have come with his baseball cap on, and he chose to come to school with his cap on. So what I'm trying to do with this paper is to revisit the concept of positioning, and through these examples, and using the original analysis, but also saying that the original analysis is lacking in its ability to look at power and the power of those citational habituated dominant discourses, or the power that anybody positioned within those or positioning themselves within those has in relation to the one who has no way of questioning those, who doesn't know or doesn't have a position allocated to them from which they can speak.
And I think the difference between Bob's response as a principal and Kathy's response as a principal is helpful for educators, I think. So how would you distinguish between their practice, and why would you say Kathy's practice is a more ethical position?
Okay, so this is something I've obviously run with quite a lot in my work subsequent to doing this, is the ethics of listening and emergent listening, where you're open to being affected by what you hear, that you don't exist in that position of dominance where the rightness of the way that you see the world can't be questioned. I see that as bound up with morality, that there are dominant accepted ways of being in the world that have a moral imperative attached to them. And I distinguish that from ethics, which is based partly on a Deleuzean ethics and partly on Badiou. And the obligation within an ethical position is to listen to the other and to be open to being affected by the other, to be open to what you don't yet know, to grant the other a position where they can take you into their world and what the world looks like from their point of view, and that you can respond to that by yourself changing. So Kath grants Shane that position of the one who's listened to, not in the sense, as adults often do and teachers often do, listen in order to check whether they know what they're talking about or check whether they respect my authority, which is the way that Bob talks, but listening in order to understand something you don't yet understand.
So she's offering a speaking position to Shane,
while she's offering a
Bob
speaking position, but much more than that. She's positioning herself as one who's vulnerable to his knowledge and his way of being in the world. Vulnerable in a very positive sense, of being open, of not being embedded in a dominant position where she knows everything and she's the one who can judge what's right. But granting him more than the right to speak, it's granting him a position as a subject who is legitimate in the world, who has a viable life, who is very keen to learn and to be a student and to be someone who can flourish in that system.
It took me a while, but I started to get a little bit sort of, Bob became a little bit of I had a bit more sympathy for him in the end by the time I'd read the story a couple of times, because it seemed to me that he also was very much caught up in a dominant way, but these citational chains of following the rules, you know, having the uniform on, you must obey.
Yep.
And, you know, there's a certain pleasure in that, and, you know, for Bob. And I did feel that in the end he was stuck, and indeed Shane could leave. You know, the special part of Shane allowed him a position that Bob couldn't take up because he was stuck with the rules. And
I think it's a really nice point, because a lot of people's response to Bob is he's a bad egg, and we've all known our own Bobs, and they're everywhere, and they're awful. And what I've done is to say it's not about Bob at all. It's about a positioning that's available to him as a school principal, that he doesn't know how to break. He's caught there and he's stuck there, and he can't. He doesn't know the way out of it. And what's so lovely about Kath is that she's studied post-structuralist theory. She has access to a different way of thinking. She has played this out in her own school with finding herself doing a Bob and then thinking, oh no, I don't want to do a Bob. There are other ways to do this. I can actually hear what the students are saying to me. So instead of, her lovely example was in another paper is Robert on the Roof, where Robert's screaming abuse up on the roof, and she starts to do a Bob and say, be careful, you might get hurt, and you need to get down, etc. And then thinks, oh no, actually what is he saying to me? And listens to him and hears that he's legitimately upset about a way a younger kid was treated. And she says to him, I didn't know this about you, that you would do just about anything for justice for a younger kid. And the effect that has on Robert is absolutely extraordinary. He just gets down off the roof, picks up his bag and goes to his classroom. It's just like extraordinary. Not that he can necessarily hold that position for an indefinite period, but for that moment he's become a viable subject.
Wondering whether do we have any more questions, or shall we lead on to the other article? Because I'm just thinking that what you said before, Bronwyn, about the difference between morality and ethics is maybe a thread that can lead us to your article about bullies as guardians of the moral order, where you talk about traditional approaches to bullying, which locate the problem in individuals, and it's kind of, I don't know, would you explain more about why that position of teachers having to judge the intentions of students is such a problematic approach?
Okay, so there's a strong conversation going on between these two papers, it was very interesting to look at the bullying literature and see the extent to which bullies were being identified and individualised and pathologised, and that tendency to pathologise ourselves is a deeply embedded part of liberal humanism, that we judge ourselves and find ourselves wanting, and we judge each other and find each other wanting. So the moralism of liberal humanism is very much embedded in that process. So we are forever correcting ourselves in order to become acceptable and viable subjects, and rushing to judge ourselves, to see that, we failed in this way or that way or that way, and doing the same in relation to other people. So I could see that the bullying research and the literature and the definitions of what a bully is were deeply embedded in that moralistic, individualistic position. But rather than finding the bully to have in this moment slipped and needing to reflect on that slippage and to think, okay, yes, I judge myself to have done something wrong here, and that I can revise that. It was identifying a whole individual as pathological, as a pathological being who was incapable of having conscience or monitoring their own behaviour or evaluating their own behaviour. So in a sense it was identifying the bullies as people who cannot in any way be recognised as viable subjects or even as human. So
you suggest a totally different approach.
Yes. So how to break out of that? And in fact, what was so frustrating, as a bit of a backstory, is that we couldn't get funding to do research on this because the people who it's going to be sent to, if it's got bullies in the title, are all the people doing the traditional research. So if you say, we want to do research that questions the fundamental assumptions of bullying research, you're not going to get funded, right? So that was a very frustrating backstory to this project.
Yeah.
So all we had was the money to get somebody to just go and talk to teachers and students and to record that talk to see what the usual discourse was, how it worked, how it played out. And we could look at that as a discourse and the way that it was implemented, and we could draw on some of that to create stories to show how it plays out in everyday practice and everyday thinking. And then as well look at the policy documents to see how bullying is defined. And because a bully is a pathological subject who doesn't have a conscience, then their intentions are necessarily bad. And so you are reading that subject as having bad intentions and having to learn from the beginning to be a new kind of subject who will develop good intentions and will discover that the nature of, or begin to discover the nature of a conscience as if they didn't have one.
So you were kind of like saying in that case, well, what say we look at this figure as in quite a different light, you know, we change the context or change the thinking around which this figure is currently located with that.
So there's a lot of research, linguistic research, philosophical research that says intentions are very intangible things. You can't actually know your own intentions. You can't know the intentions of the other. Intentions are a big deal within the moral order of liberal humanism, that your acts flow from your intentions. So you read back the intentions are the thing that formed the act. From a linguistic perspective, Deborah Tannen did some lovely research on intentionality, where she showed that in arguments between men and women, that if a woman said to a man, what you've just done or said hurts me, the man would tend to say, from his dominant masculine position, how stupid are you to think that I would intend to hurt you? You should know me better. And so wanting to take up the very position that Sano and Bob took up, which is I know what's right, I know how to behave, I'm a subject with a conscience, and you're just silly because you don't understand that it wasn't offensive because I wouldn't have meant it to be offensive. Whereas if it was the other way around and the man accused the woman of having hurt him with what she'd said or done, she would immediately apologise for the hurt and then explain it wasn't her intention. So she would see harm had been done, accept harm has been done. It requires an apology. Then it requires some reference to intention. So intentionality is a very messy thing. And to build in intentionality into the way of working out who is a bully and who is not, who are we going to pathologise, is impossible. It's ridiculous, but it's there. And the teachers are busy reading that, and the kids are busy reading that. How does this thing called intentionality relate to the act and relate to who I take myself to be? As a viable subject, if I'm not regarded as a bully, but I've actually done something that's really terrible, how do I manage those two things? And there's an example there of a boy who manages it quite well. It's for a moment I did something that really wasn't me, but the really me is still there because I'm a person with good intentions and a conscience. I mean, he doesn't say that, but that's the implicit statement. Whereas somebody who's been pathologised isn't granted that possibility. So, and there's another example where girls have done something really appalling and smashed a younger kid who was a refugee up against the wall and knocked his teeth out. But because they cry about it when they're confronted, well, then they must have a conscience, and therefore they're not bullies. So the intentionality can really mess up the teacher's capacity and the kid's capacity to work out what's going on here. So the shift then to looking at this differently, to saying that is a whole problematic citational chain that people get caught up in this bullying sphere, and it's not working because all the evidence is that all of our policies and practices to change, to get rid of bullying in schools don't work. So there's just as much bullying going on as there ever was. So it hasn't worked. So we need another way of thinking about it. And as I looked at the data, I also went outside of what we had. I went outside of the interview transcripts that we had, went outside of the existing literature, and I looked at things like Margaret Atwood's Cat's Eye, because often novelists will come up with a brilliant insight into what goes on between children, drawn from their own childhood, but they can develop it in really interesting and different ways, and see how we get embedded in the bullying practices and in receiving bullying. So I looked at the usual ways of talking, the citational chains, and I looked at the sort of philosophical background that would enable me to question some of what it had come up with and the ways in which it was working. And then I looked, and we also, we did a collective biography on bullying. And we looked at examples of when we had been bullied from our childhoods, and we looked at examples when we'd been bullies, which was a really shocking thing to do. To think, it's not just them. All of us have been caught up in positions where we've dominated others. And we've been quite self-justifying about that. We've found ways to make it quite right that we would pull weight in situations, and then quite shocked when the person that we've pushed around or bullied has become tearful and unable to come to work anymore, and goodness me, yes, actually we've been engaged in bullying. So that was a really important part of my pathway to thinking about bullies differently, to be on the side of the bully through our own childhood story, having been bullies and having been bullied, and to make more movement there. So then reading about the Deleuzean difference between morality and ethics, which has been a very powerful thread for me in my own work, to make that distinction of one that goes back to Aristotle and this idea that I spelled out at the beginning of the liberal humanist subject, who's always at fault, and can always be found fault with, and must always be continuously improving themselves toward the ideal subject, and the Deleuzean ethics, which says to put moralism and judgment to one side, and to simply ask of the other, what is it to be this? And to be open in that question to being changed by what you hear. To me, that is, it just opens a whole other world. And to say of the bully, what is it to be this? It brings forth this answer that they're guardians of the moral order. When you look at what they say, that's what they think they're doing. The girls who pushed the boy up against the wall and broke his teeth out were intent on maintaining a moral order where a black boy couldn't chase white girls in a game of kiss and catch. That's right outside the moral order as he understood, as the girls understood it. And they should put an end to that. And so as I re-examined the data with that question in mind, what is it to be this? And putting moralism and judgment to one side, the possibility of imagining what it's like to be Bob, going back to the other paper, And the possibility of imagining how you get caught up in being a bully is opened up. So that's...
So you suggesting a totally different approach and looking at how the normative order actually produces bullying behaviours. So, and you suggesting that children should be taught to think about that. So
Yes.
would you say a few words about how you imagine it happening in schools? How could teachers have conversations with children about what it is in the normative order that harms, oppresses others, and how to catch ourselves doing that?
Yeah, and I think in order for that to take place, the teachers themselves need to have done some significant work in making discourse visible to themselves, and to see that there are multiple discourses and there are ways in which people are positioned within those discourses. So that once having grasped that, and then once having also arrived at a point where children are people that you can respect as capable of understanding that, then you can start up the conversations of, oh, let's look at this and see how it works. If we say this, then how does that work to position you in this way and me in this way? And one of the strategies that I've worked with teachers is to not wait till they've got a problem, but to, for example, invite the kids to notice if they use sexist language and to pull them up on it. To say, hey miss, did you just say, and then the teacher to stop and say, oh, did I just say that? Oh, okay, so that is a problem, because that assumes that, not in these words, but that assumes the generic subject is a male, and that's not right. That so I don't want to be speaking in that way, and then to get on with that. So to make language visible and to make the work that language does visible, and to make themselves vulnerable to insofar as they're people who can get it wrong, because we can have great intentions, to get back to intentions, to not speak in sexist ways, but it's actually very difficult to revise your language. And kids get it so quickly to see what sexist language is and how it works, and to interrupt the flow of your talk and to bring your attention to it, so to open up a discussion about the power of language and the way it works.
I'm thinking about the idea of citational chains and becoming caught up in them, and all that you're saying about kids being much quicker to the draw on that, and much more capable of being flexible and learning faster. And so, I'm back to Bob. I don't know why I'm back to him, but, his position, how do you put it to Bob that he might have a dominant position here, but he's caught up in these chains, successful man as he is. And, to me, that's part of the work that I'm finding it difficult to understand. How do you sell to somebody who's successful under liberal or neoliberalism that in fact really that guardianship of the moral order is making them a bully? Yet in society they have clear evidence of how well they have done through these particular manoeuvres or these citational chains.
It's an important question, and I don't have an answer really, but we need to get back to a point where it becomes standard normative practice for teachers and principals to engage in higher education, to actually take time out from their work to study and to think and to reflect and to start to read papers like Bullies as Guardians, and to start to get a new language to think with. And you couldn't just approach Bob and say, think about this, Bob. That's not going to work.
Much as you'd like to.
But you can have workshops for principals. You can encourage engagements with them with material like this, and you know, to enrol in a master's, to enrol in a PhD, to actually start taking that up as a legitimate part of being a teacher and being an administrator, is that doing that analytic work on their own practice and getting hold of philosophical concepts that they haven't had a chance to get in their earlier education can make a difference. So when I started to work with Kath, she was enrolled in a PhD, and she was one of the people in the education system who'd written a lot of the policies on behavioural disorders and so on. She just wanted a PhD to legitimate what she'd already done. And it took her all of the 6 years that we worked together, part-time, for her to begin to see things differently and to practice differently. So one conversation with Bob isn't going to do it.
No.
It has to be Bob coming and enrolling in a PhD with a willingness to examine his own practice. Even, I mean, the workshops that I did with principals in the book Power, Knowledge, Desire, they were hard work. They're very hard work. I'm sorry to say, if there's any principals looking at this, you are hard work. Your embeddedness in positions of power makes it really, really difficult for you to see what it is that this work is trying to do.
But I think the habitual citations are very hard to get rid of. So, as you say, you need to learn new language to actually break them and establish something new. And it might take longer than one conversation, but years of study. And it's really hard work. And I always think that neoliberal organisation or managerial practices really are not very supportive of doing that kind of work.
And in Australia, the unions have played a crucial part in getting rid of doing further study as a part of teachers' work. So that was quite devastating for me, that they would do that, that undid the space in which it had become possible for me to do what I felt was very important work with the in-service degree work that was a large part of my work at University of New England.
I think we very much like to keep working with our students on this material, and I know some of them do find it challenging, but I also think that idea that we can all work in the in-between space, you know, between Shane, between Bob, and try and find out what it is that binds them together in such difficult situations, you know, in these difficult conversations. And maybe if we can unpack a bit more of that. I just keep thinking it's very helpful. It's been helpful to me as a teacher. So, yeah, but I, you know, with Maria, it's not easy work.
No. I mean, if it was easy, it would be boring. And then why would you bother? If you know it already, why would you bother? It's got to be challenging and to be exciting, to grab you. It's got to be hard.
I think
we
that's
could
a
do.
good note to finish on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Bronwyn.
My pleasure.
Wonderful.